My stepson saw me wearing a miniskirt, and in that moment, everything changed. What happens when an innocent encounter stirs emotions that should never surface? And how do you navigate a world where boundaries blur and choices threaten to unravel the life you've built? Before we dive into this story of forbidden emotions and impossible decisions, make sure to subscribe for more thought-provoking tales like this one. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from today? When I slipped into the miniskirt that afternoon, I didn't think twice about it. It had been buried in the back of my closet for years, a relic of a younger, bolder version of myself. My husband had left on another business trip that morning, and the house was unusually quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher. I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror, smoothing the fabric against my hip. For a fleeting moment, I felt alive again. Then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the silence. I froze, my hands mid-adjustment, as my stepson's voice called out, "Hey, I'm home." His footsteps grew louder, and before I could grab a robe or slip into something less conspicuous, he appeared in the doorway of the living room. His face registered surprise, and then something else. Something I couldn't quite place. His eyes lingered for a beat longer than they should have, scanning me in a way that made my skin flush under his gaze. "Wow," he said, his voice low and slightly incredulous. "I didn't know you owned something like that." I laughed nervously, brushing off his comment. "Oh, this old thing? I was just cleaning out my closet." He stepped further into the room, his presence suddenly overwhelming. He was taller now, broader than I remembered. College had transformed him from a lanky teenager into a confident young man, and there was something in the way he carried himself, an air of self-assuredness that was both intimidating and intriguing. "Well, it looks good on you," he said, his tone casual but his eyes anything but. I shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the hem of the skirt. "Thanks," I murmured, turning away under the pretense of tidying the already pristine coffee table. My pulse was racing, and I hated myself for the heat creeping up my neck. This was my stepson, for God's sake. But the way he looked at me, it was different. Different in a way that left me unsettled and inexplicably flattered. He lingered for a moment longer before heading to the kitchen, leaving me to grapple with the sudden whirlwind of emotions. What just happened? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I busied myself with mundane tasks, trying to shake off the strange tension that had filled the air. But every time I saw him, whether he was sprawled on the couch scrolling through his phone or leaning against the kitchen counter drinking water, that moment replayed in my mind. His eyes, his voice, the way he said, "It looks good on you." By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted, emotionally more than physically. My husband had called earlier to check in, his voice distant and distracted as he rattled off his schedule. It was the same every trip, polite pleasantries, a few obligatory "miss you," and then silence. It had been years since he'd looked at me the way my stepson had earlier that day. I shook off the thought, chastising myself for even comparing the two. This was ridiculous. I needed to pull myself together. After dinner, I found myself alone on the patio, a glass of wine in hand. The warm summer air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass, and the distant hum of cicadas filled the silence. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over me, when I heard the sliding door open. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, stepping onto the patio. I glanced up, startled. "Of course not," I said, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. He settled into the chair, his long legs stretching out in front of him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. the quiet hum of the evening wrapping around us like a blanket. Then he broke the silence. "You seemed off earlier," he said, his tone careful but probing. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, swirling the wine in my glass. "Just tired," I lied, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day." He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady and disarming. "You know, you don't have to pretend around me," he said softly. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. I looked away, suddenly feeling exposed. "I'm fine, really," I said, my voice firmer this time. But the truth was, I wasn't fine, not even close. He didn't push me further, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. We sat in silence for a while, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. I finished my wine and excused myself, retreating to the safety of my bedroom. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening to me? The next morning, I awoke feeling restless. The events of the previous day lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling of tension that hung in the air. The house was quiet again. My stepson had gone for a morning jog, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the empty street. The door opened just as I brought the cup to my lips. He walked in, his t-shirt clinging to his chest and damp with sweat. His hair was tousled, and there was a light sheen on his skin that only emphasized the definition in his arms. He saw me watching and gave a lopsided grin. "Good morning," he said, his voice slightly breathless. I nodded, setting the mug down. "Morning. You're back early." Yeah, didn't feel like going far today." He grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and leaned against the counter, his eyes drifting to me. "You seem more relaxed today." I forced a laugh. "Maybe I needed some sleep. Or maybe you needed a change," he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. I glanced at him, unsure how to respond. There was an unspoken energy between us, a current that seemed to pull me in even as I tried to resist. I focused on cleaning the counter, anything to avoid the intensity of his gaze. He chuckled softly. "You don't have to be so nervous around me." "I'm not nervous," I said quickly, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. He stepped closer, the warmth of his presence sending a shiver down my spine. "You are," he said gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you don't have to be." The air between us was thick, charged with something I didn't dare name. I turned away, desperate to escape the moment, but his voice stopped me. "You deserve to feel seen," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally turned back to him, his eyes were filled with an understanding that was both comforting and dangerous. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The sound of his phone buzzing on the counter broke the moment. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "I should shower," he said, his voice lighter now, as if nothing had happened. "Don't want to stink up the whole house." I nodded, still unable to speak, and watched as he disappeared up the stairs. The silence he left behind was deafening. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the tension lingered like an unwelcome guest. I busied myself with chores, trying to focus on anything other than the lingering heat of his words. When evening came, my stepson suggested we watch a movie together. It was a tradition we'd had since he was a teenager, and I couldn't find a reason to say no. We settled onto the couch, the glow of the TV casting soft shadows across the room. He sat closer than usual, his arm resting on the back of the couch behind me. It felt intimate in a way that made my pulse quicken, but I told myself it was harmless. The movie played on, but I barely paid attention. I was hyper-aware of his presence, the warmth of his body so close to mine. At one point, our hands brushed as we both reached for the bowl of popcorn. I pulled away quickly, but his fingers lingered, grazing mine in a way that felt deliberate. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low and filled with concern. "Yeah," I said, though my voice cracked slightly. "Just tired." He nodded, his eyes searching mine. "You can tell me if something's wrong, you know." I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "I'm fine, really." We sat in silence for the rest of the movie, the unspoken tension thickening with each passing minute. When it ended, I excused myself and went to bed, my mind racing. The next morning, I resolved to put distance between us. This was getting out of hand, and I couldn't let it continue. I spent the day running errands, staying out of the house as much as possible. By the time I returned, the sun was setting, and the house was quiet again. I found him in the kitchen, cooking dinner. The sight of him standing at the stove, his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly disheveled, was disarming. He looked up as I entered, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey," he said, "I figured I'd cook tonight. You've been doing so much." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "That's sweet of you," I said finally. "Just trying to help out," he said, his tone casual but his eyes betraying something deeper. We ate in relative silence, the clink of silverware the only sound between us. When we finished, he insisted on doing the dishes, waving me off when I tried to help. I retreated to the living room, feeling both relieved and unsettled. A few minutes later, he joined me, sitting on the opposite end of the couch. The distance felt deliberate, as if he was trying to give me space. I appreciated the gesture, but it didn't ease the tension that seemed to have taken permanent residence in the house. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "About what?" I asked, my voice cautious. "About us," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "About how things have felt different lately." My breath caught in my throat. "Different how?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said finally. "But I feel like there's something we're not talking about." I looked away, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said softly. "And it's okay. I think we should talk about it." I stood abruptly, unable to face the weight of his words. "I think you're reading too much into things," I said, my voice shaky. "I need to go to bed." He stood as well, his expression filled with concern. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," he said. "That was never my intention." I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. "Good night," I said quickly, retreating to my bedroom and locking the door behind me. As I lay in bed that night, his words replayed in my mind. He was right. Something had shifted between us, and no matter how much I tried to deny it, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The next morning felt heavier, as though the air in the house carried the weight of our unspoken truths. I avoided my stepson as much as possible, sticking to my bedroom or keeping myself busy in the backyard garden. Still, I could feel him, his presence lingering just out of sight. Every sound, the creak of the stairs, the soft hum of the TV, was a reminder that he was there and that things between us were anything but normal. By late afternoon, I decided to confront the suffocating atmosphere in the house. I wasn't sure what I would say, but I knew I couldn't let this tension continue. I found him in the garage, tinkering with his old bike. He looked up as I approached, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else. Something deeper. "Hey," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't think I'd see you out here." I crossed my arms, trying to steady my voice. "We need to talk." He nodded, setting the rag down. "Yeah, I figured." I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. This, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's not healthy. "It's not healthy," Grace answered. His eyes searched mine, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "I know," he said softly, "but it's not like I planned for this to happen." "Neither did I admitted, my voice trembling. "But it did, and we can't ignore it. It's wrong." He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "Is it wrong to feel something for someone? To want to be close to them?" "It is," I said, though my words felt hollow. "You're my stepson. This isn't normal. It's not right." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I've been trying to fight it, too," he said. "But every time I'm around you, I feel connected. Like you see me, really see me, in a way no one else does." I looked away, my chest tightening. His words struck a chord, and I hated that they did. I'd spent years feeling invisible, unappreciated, and here he was, making me feel like I mattered in ways I hadn't in a long time. But that didn't make it okay. "You can't say things like that," I whispered. "It only makes this harder." "Harder for who?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "For you? For me? Because it's already hard enough, pretending like I don't feel what I feel every time I'm around you." I took a step back, shaking my head. "This has to stop," I said firmly. "Whatever you're feeling, whatever I'm feeling, it has to stop." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "Just give me some space." He nodded reluctantly, his eyes filled with an ache that mirrored my own. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll back off. But I'm here if you ever need to talk," and turned and walked away, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of our conversation replayed in my mind, his words echoing in the quiet darkness. "You see me," he'd said. And the truth was, I did see him. I saw the boy who had grown into a man, the one who had filled the empty spaces in my home and, unintentionally, in my heart. But I also saw the lines we couldn't cross, the consequences we couldn't ignore. I saw my husband, oblivious and trusting, and I hated myself for even entertaining the feelings I'd tried so hard to bury. Sometime after midnight, I gave up on sleep and went downstairs for a glass of water. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I leaned against the counter, the cool glass pressed to my forehead, trying to quiet the storm inside me. "You couldn't sleep either, huh?" His voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled and his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He wore a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, and yet he seemed more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, stepping into the kitchen. "I just needed some water." "It's fine," I said quickly, turning back to the sink. I was just heading back to bed. Inhale. Wait, he said, his voice stopping me in my tracks. Can we just talk for a second? No pressure, no expectations. Just talk. You and I. I hesitated, my grip tightening on the glass. What's there left to say? Plenty, he said, moving closer. Like how we ended up here, how everything got so complicated. I sighed, setting the glass down. What's the point? Talking won't change anything. Maybe not, he admitted, but it might help, for both of us. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Fine, I said. Talk. My voice rose. He leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge as if grounding himself. I never wanted to make things weird between us, he began. When I came back from school, I just thought it'd be nice to spend some time here, with family. But then I saw you, and it was like something clicked, like I was seeing you for the first time. I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. You shouldn't feel that way. I know, he said. Believe me, I've tried not to, but I can't help it. And I don't think you can either. My head snapped up, his words hitting me like a punch to the gut. Don't put this on me, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't about what I feel. Isn't it? He asked, his voice quiet but insistent. I see the way you look at me, the way you pull away every time we're close, like you're afraid of what might happen. I'm not afraid, I said, though the quiver in my voice betrayed me. Yes, you are, he said, stepping closer, and so am I. But that doesn't make what we're feeling any less real. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. This is wrong, I whispered. We can't do this. I know, he said, his voice breaking. But I don't know how to stop. The raw honesty in his voice shattered something inside me. I turned away, tears spilling down my cheeks. You have to stop, I said, my voice barely audible, for both of our sakes. He was silent for a moment, and then I felt his hand on my shoulder. It was a gentle touch, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. I'm sorry, he said, his voice filled with regret. I never wanted to hurt you. I nodded, unable to speak. When I finally turned back, he was gone, the door to his room clicking shut behind him. The following day, he told me he was leaving. He said he needed space, time to figure things out. I didn't argue. I knew it was for the best. But that didn't make it any easier. As I watched him pack his car, a part of me wanted to ask him to stay, to tell him we could figure it out together. But I didn't. I couldn't. He hugged me before he left, a lingering embrace that said everything we couldn't. When he pulled away, his eyes searched mine one last time. Take care of yourself, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You too, I whispered, and then he was gone. As his car disappeared down the street, I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like something was missing, something I couldn't quite name, but knew I would feel forever. The days that followed his departure were both a relief and a torment. The house felt emptier than ever, a hollow shell that echoed with memories I couldn't shake. I tried to bury myself in routine, cleaning, organizing, even attempting to rekindle a spark in my marriage. Then, a truth lingered in every corner of my mind. Something had shifted irrevocably, and there was no going back. My husband returned from his business trip a week later, as cheerful and oblivious as ever. He greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, the same cursory gesture I'd grown used to over the years. As he unpacked his suitcase, he rattled off stories about meetings, clients, and the mundane details of his travel schedule. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere. "Where's Alex?" he asked suddenly, snapping me back to reality. I hesitated, my pulse quickening. "He went back to school early," I said, keeping my voice steady. "He said he needed to get a head start on some projects." My husband nodded, accepting the explanation without question. "Good for him," he said, his tone distracted as he sorted through a pile of receipts. "He's got a good head on his shoulders." I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. Guilt churned in my stomach, a relentless knot that refused to unravel. If only he knew the truth, the tangled web of emotions I'd found myself ensnared in. But I couldn't tell him. The weight of it was mine to bear alone. I murmured. A few days later, I received a text from Alex. It was short and simple, but it hit me like a freight train. "I miss you." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. My first instinct was to delete the message, to pretend I hadn't seen it. But my fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between reason and the undeniable pull I still felt toward him. Finally, I typed a response. "This isn't fair to either of us." I hit send before I could change my mind, my hands trembling. The reply came almost instantly. "I know, but I can't help it." I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Every part of me wanted to respond, to give in to the longing that had taken root in my heart. But I couldn't. Not again. Instead, I put the phone down and walked away, leaving it on the kitchen counter as if distance could sever the connection between us. "Ariel." That evening, my husband suggested we go out for dinner. It was a rare occurrence, one I would have been excited about months ago, but now it felt like an obligation, a way to keep up the facade of normalcy. We sat across from each other at a cozy Italian restaurant, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on his face. He looked at me with a familiar warmth, but it felt distant, like a photograph of a memory rather than the real thing. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his tone laced with concern. "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, swirling the wine in my glass. "Just tired," I said, the same excuse I'd been using for weeks. "There's been a lot on my mind." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right?" The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear. I nodded, my throat tightening. "I know," I said softly. Anchor oneself. But the truth was, I couldn't. Not about this. The weeks turned into months and life settled into a fragile routine. I tried to focus on my marriage, on rebuilding the connection that had been fraying for years. We took weekend trips, attended couples cooking classes, and even started planning a long overdue vacation. On the surface, everything seemed fine. But beneath it all, a part of me was still tangled up in the memory of Alex. His voice, his touch, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I told myself I was moving on, that I was doing the right thing. But then, on a quiet Saturday morning, I opened my email to find a message from him. Subject, "Just thinking about you." Adi. "Hi. I don't know if I should be writing this, but I can't stop thinking about you. I know we said we'd put this behind us, but I miss you. I miss the way you made me feel like I mattered. I miss your smile, your laugh, everything. I'm sorry if this makes things harder for you. I just needed you to know. My heart sank as I read the words, a mix of emotions crashing over me. Anger, sadness, longing. They all swirled together, leaving me feeling raw and exposed. I stared at the screen, my finger hovering over the delete button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Instead, I closed the laptop and walked away, my mind racing. The walls I'd carefully built around my heart were crumbling, and I didn't know how to stop it. It hurt. That evening, as my husband and I sat in the living room watching a movie, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Alex's name on the screen. I quickly silenced the phone, hoping my husband hadn't noticed, but the message lingered in my mind, an unspoken invitation that I didn't know how to ignore. Later that night, when my husband was asleep, I crept downstairs and unlocked my phone. The message was simple, but devastatingly effective. I'm in town. Can we meet? I stared at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to say no, to shut this down once and for all, but a small, treacherous part of me, the part that still felt the pull of him, wanted to say yes. Against my better judgment, I typed a response. Where? The next afternoon, I found myself sitting in a quiet coffee shop, my hands trembling as I clutched a steaming mug. When the door opened and Alex walked in, my breath caught in my throat. He looked the same, maybe a little older, a little more tired, but still the same. His eyes lit up when they met mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. He slid into the seat across from me, his smile tinged with nervousness. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. Finally, he broke the silence. "I'm sorry for reaching out," he said. "I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't stop myself." I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "Why are you here, Alex?" "Because I needed to see you," he said simply. "I needed to know if you still feel it." Too. I looked away, my heart aching. "This isn't fair," I said. "To me, to you, to him." "I know," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But I can't stop thinking about you. I've tried, and I can't." I wiped a tear from my cheek, my hands trembling. "I don't know what to say. Just tell me the truth," he said, leaning forward. "Do you feel it? Or am I crazy?" I closed my eyes, the truth clawing its way to the surface. "Yes," I whispered. "I feel it." He exhaled, relief and anguish mingling in his expression. "Then, what do we do?" "I don't know," I said, my voice breaking. "But we can't keep doing this." He nodded, his eyes filled with pain. I needed to hear you say it, even if it doesn't change anything." We sat in silence, the weight of our emotions pressing down on us. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated, his eyes searching mine one last time. And then, "Take care of yourself," he said softly. "You too," I replied, my voice barely audible. And then he was gone, leaving me to grapple with the impossible choice between my past and my present. For days after that coffee shop meeting, I felt as though I were living in two separate realities. In one, I was the wife, the homemaker, the dependable partner who laughed at my husband's jokes and planned meals for the week. In the other, I was consumed by the memory of Alex, his voice, his eyes, the way he made me feel more alive than I had in years. The weight of it all was suffocating, and no amount of busy work could distract me from the truth. I was unraveling. My husband remained blissfully unaware, wrapped up in his work and our surface-level attempts at reconnecting. He seemed content, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. But every time I looked at him, the guilt gnawed at me. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve my secrets, my betrayals, even if they were more emotional than physical. But was that really true? Had I crossed the line already? The questions haunted me late into the night, replaying in my mind like a broken record. And then there was Alex. His words echoed in my head. Do you feel it too? I had answered honestly, but now I wished I hadn't. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, my phone buzzed with a message. I hesitated, knowing before I even looked that it was him. Alex, I'm sorry if I made things harder for you. I just needed to be honest. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. He was always so careful, so considerate, even when I wished he wouldn't be. Part of me wanted to ignore him, to delete the message and move on. But another part, the part that had been craving something more, couldn't resist. Me, it's okay. I don't know how to handle this. The reply came almost instantly. Alex, you don't have to handle it alone. Tears pricked my eyes as I set the phone down. I felt as though I were standing on a precipice, teetering between two worlds. One offered stability, familiarity, and the life I had built with my husband. The other was dangerous, unpredictable, and undeniably thrilling. I told myself it was just a conversation. A message here and there couldn't hurt, right? But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Over the next few weeks, Alex and I slipped into an unspoken rhythm. We didn't meet again in person, but we texted often, late at night when the house was quiet. Our messages were guarded at first, careful not to cross any explicit lines, but as time went on, the walls between us began to crumble. He told me about his life, his classes, his friends, the pressures of figuring out who he wanted to be. I told him about mine, the loneliness, the feeling of being invisible, the way my marriage had become more of a partnership than a romance. We shared pieces of ourselves that we hadn't shared with anyone else. And with each message, the connection between us deepened. One night, as I lay in bed beside my sleeping husband, Alex sent a message that made my heart stop. Alex, I think about that day in the living room. You in that skirt. I've never been able to forget it. I stared at the words, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. I knew I should shut it down, draw a line in the sand before things went too far. But instead, I found myself typing a response. Me, I've thought about it too. The words felt like a confession, a release of something I'd been holding on to for too long. When his reply came, it was simple, but devastating. I wish things were different. I didn't respond. I couldn't. But the weight of those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. The next day, I threw myself into chores, desperate to quiet my racing thoughts. I scrubbed the kitchen counters, vacuumed the living room, and even tackled the overgrown weeds in the backyard. But no matter how hard I worked, I couldn't escape the growing realization that I was in too deep. That evening, as my husband and I sat down for dinner, he gave me a curious look. "You've been acting strange lately," he said, his tone light but probing. "Is everything okay?" I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. Of course, I said quickly, forcing a smile. Why wouldn't it be? He shrugged, his brow furrowing slightly. I don't know. You just seem distracted. I've just been busy, I said, waving a hand dismissively. You know how it is. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. I felt exposed, as though he could see straight through me. I forced myself to finish dinner, keeping the conversation light and casual, but inside I was crumbling. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds. I needed to make a choice, for better or worse. The next morning, I sent Alex a message. We need to talk, in person. His reply was immediate. Alex, when and where? We agreed to meet later that afternoon at a park on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet spot, far enough away from prying eyes. As I drove there, my heart raced with a mixture of dread and anticipation. I didn't know what I was going to say, only that I needed to say something. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting on a bench under a sprawling oak tree. He stood as I approached, his expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. Hi, he said softly. Hi, I replied, my voice barely audible. We sat down, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Finally, I took a deep breath and turned to face him. This has to stop, I said, my voice trembling. Whatever this is, it has to end. His face fell, the hope in his eyes flickering out like a dying flame. Why? He asked. Because it's wrong? Because you're scared? Yes, I said, tears welling in my eyes. Because it's all of those things. I care about you, Alex, more than I should. But I can't keep doing this. It's not fair to you, to me, or to him. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I don't care about what's fair, he said. I care about you, and I know you care about me too. That doesn't make it right, I said, my voice breaking. It doesn't change the fact that this can't happen. He was silent for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. So that's it? He said finally. You're just going to walk away? I have to, I whispered. I'm sorry. He stood abruptly, his face a mask of anger and pain. Fine, he said, if that's what you want. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone on the bench. I watched him go, my heart shattering with every step he took. When he disappeared from view, I buried my face in my hands and sobbed. I had made my choice, but it felt like I had lost everything in the process. The days after Alex walked away were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. The silence was unbearable, stretching endlessly through the house like an unwelcome guest. I threw myself into my marriage, desperate to repair the cracks that had widened into chasms. I planned date nights, cooked elaborate dinners, and even started waking up early to sit with my husband over breakfast before he left for work. But no matter how much effort I put in, I couldn't escape the void Alex had left behind. I missed him, his laugh, his honesty, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was a hollow ache that no amount of distraction could fill.